very interesting question. Asked about a person who astrologically carries a very strong signature of the warrior archetype, which could be indicated by the sun in Aries, for example, or a strong Aries signature, or the planet Mars lined up with the sun, or Mars rising. There's a lot of ways to say it astrologically, but we get the idea of this fierceness and this quality of piss and vinegar in the person. And we imagine an individual who has that kind of nature, and the question is, how can they be a good Buddhist? How can they practice loving kindness, Dharma, and compassion? The question was presented to me in those terms literally, but I would actually extend the terrain of the question a bit and say, same question, how can they be a good Christian, or how can they be truly a good Muslim, or you name it really, because all of the religions are guilty of, bloodshed and blood on their hands and all of that. But all of them in their highest, best, and most central form, of course, preach forgiveness and kindness and the turning of the other cheek under most circumstances. So how can we be a Marsi person and still a spiritual person? Might be the really core of the question. But let me begin to wrestle with that. The first thing I would say is that, if you were born with a strong Mars signature, it is not a sign of your sinful nature. It's not a sign that the universe made some kind of mistake with you and you need to try to operate counter to your nature for the rest of your life. That's not true at all. The key in understanding astrology, or one key at least, is that everybody has exactly the right chart, and there is no chart that's wrong, and there's no chart that's more spiritual than any other. Everything depends upon the consciousness we bring to bear in the given situation. If you have a very martial kind of chart, you are learning the lesson of the spiritual warrior in this lifetime. One dimension of that is the idea that in order to have the experiences that trigger a higher state of consciousness for you, you must face your fears. You must face your fears. That's really the heart of the matter. So we could imagine, for example, a person with that kind of martial chart who suddenly feels a compelling inner drive to go to Tibet. Now, going to Tibet, given the present political situation, is pretty scary. And even if the situation were more comfortable, Tibet itself is not particularly comfortable. If we are accustomed to the amenities of Western civilization, we might find it deep down inside kind of a frightening prospect to make a journey to an exotic and isolated place like that, full of people who don't speak English, etc., or whatever language we're accustomed to. And so this particular individual faces a fear and actually has this adventure with a spiritual intention underlying the adventure. Wouldn't be doing it unless there were that spiritual drive to go to the motherland of at least Northern Buddhism. So off they go to Tibet, and when they come back, they're a different person. And if they hadn't taken on that warrior path of having the adventurous experience, they would not have had the catalyst in their consciousness that led to this great opening of the third eye, or their being becoming so wide. Fear can be a great teacher. There's an aphorism or a saying among saltwater sailors that there is no pump in this world like a frightened man with a bucket. That always makes me smile, but of course when we're scared, we are highly motivated, highly focused. I picture a person with a strong Mars function who finds his guru, let's say. And this will be a little bit of a cartoon, but it will make a serious point. The guru says you should sit in meditation. And so the person sits down and enters into this kind of soporific state, which is confused with meditation, sitting peacefully, kind of drifting and unfocused. And meanwhile, our guru, with our hero having the eyes closed, the guru calls for a firecracker. And as quietly as he can, he lights the firecracker and he places it right next to the foot of our person sitting in meditation. And of course, in a few seconds, boom, and our hero opens his eyes. He is terribly frightened at this explosion. And the guru points and says, that's meditation. That's Mars meditation. Here and now, absolute focus, harnessing a state of stimulation, a state of hypervigilance. I'm tempted to say even a state of fear or something akin to fear, and making it your friend and using it to bring you to a sharp focus in the present moment. This is a mystical interpretation of the Mars function. Now let me go a little bit further with it. Warriors kill. That's an uncomfortable statement, but anyone who attempts to sit with the warrior archetype, but they're too wimpy to embrace that one, is missing half the point. That's one of the things warriors do. And we can extend the point just a little bit further and say warriors, even when they're not killing, are often in competitive relationships with other beings, and they will often do damage to other beings, even the relatively mild damage of preventing another being from getting what he or she wants. Warriors are inherently competitive, so there is that violent element to the Mars archetype. And needless to say, it's exceedingly difficult for a person with really any kind of spiritual orientation to be comfortable with this notion of doing violence to other beings. And yet we have to somehow embrace it. How can we do that? Well, I think there is one way, and I think it's very clear once we look at it carefully. There is a condition under which if a person does damage to another, it is almost universally greeted as a positive thing. And as strange as that sounds, I think you'll recognize it as soon as I say it. It is when we lift up the sword in defense of the innocent. When some dark force has aggressively massed against a being who is innocent and cannot defend himself or herself. And we raise the sword, and sometimes even use the sword, in order to prevent this dark violence against the innocent being. There are, in some traditions, those who would even question that, but most of humanity would recognize such a person not to be evil, but really to be more like heroic. Let me add a significant footnote to this. On the list of the innocent, we can include ourselves. That can be a little forced, perhaps, in some situations, but what I'm getting at here is, again, every civilized country, society, recognizes that we have a right to defend ourselves. If we are not doing anyone any harm, and we are attacked, and we take up the sword in our own defense and do damage to the attacker, it is generally agreed that this is appropriate behavior, that the organism has this right. I want to be very careful not to romanticize these kinds of things, but I want to recognize that if you are, let us say, both a martial person and a Buddhist, you may very well, in the language of Buddhism, be called upon to be a Dharma protector. You may very well be called upon to stand loudly and clearly against something that would do damage to other beings or would do damage to the truth and the well-being of the truth in the community. I had, for example, a situation in my professional life where a yoga teacher who was very martial found herself in the situation where it had come to her that another yoga teacher in her city was taking sexual advantage of some of the students. And we hear a story like that once or twice, and maybe we shrug our shoulders because people will be people, and that's maybe just the way it was. But the story came through so often, it was very clear that this person, in the name of yoga, was exploiting a community. And the question she brought to me was, should I do something about this, or should I let it be? And I don't think that there is really one right answer that fits everybody when it comes to that question. But for her, given her nature, I said, raise the sword. Speak of this, speak to this man at least, and let him know that there will be consequences for his behavior if he continues it, because the Dharma must be protected. And don't make a threat that you do not intend to carry out. That's more warrior stuff. As the story unfolded, it got pretty ugly. And in the end, the person who was exploiting the students was, in fact, forced to leave the community as the word got out. It was not a pretty situation, but the Dharma was protected. I want to be so careful to avoid our human attachment to this kind of drama. The Dalai Lama himself once said, "The world is drunk on anger," which I think is one of the deepest, simple things I've ever heard in my life. The world is drunk on anger. We love the idea of sticking it to the bad guy. And we've got to be very careful with that. If you're trying to be spiritual and you're working with Mars energy, be wary of falling into that trap. But recognize that you might be called upon to lift the sword in a spirit of pure love and warrior responsibility for the well-being of others.